Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. Both of today's guests have recently published memoirs with Delphinium Books, and although the events of their lives have been quite different, they have a number of things in common. Both have written best-selling books over the course of their careers, and both cite a kind of a Proustian Madeline as the trigger for many of their memories. It is with great pleasure that I welcome to our show now Kathleen Hill to discuss her memoir. She read to us in the late afternoon, Life in Novels, author of One of These Things First. Hello, good to see you.
Hi.
Hello.
Proust's Remembrance of Things Past is technically a novel, but hasn't it been argued that although memoirs are understood to be factual, they often have a lot more in common with works of fiction than they have with autobiographies?
Well, that's interesting that you mentioned Proust, because I think, from what I can understand in the Anglo-American world, there's a much sharper distinction between fiction and nonfiction, or memoir and fiction, than there is, say, in France with Proust or Marguerite Duras or Colette, or I don't know, a number of others that they don't seem to distinguish as much.
Well, we call autobiographical novel.
Exactly.
In their case, it was kind of understood that they were drawing upon their lives in their so-called fiction.
Yes, and a tradition of lyrical prose, maybe.
Well, in the English tradition, English language tradition, a biography or autobiography tells the story of a life, while a memoir often tells the story from a life.
Yes.
Yes. Were you thinking
I
that?
don't understand what you mean from a life.
In other words, I guess there's a more of an emotional connection, less of a dependence on the factual aspect.
I never knew that. I thought that a memoir, this was my own definition, I made this up, but I thought an autobiography was your entire life and a memoir was just a section or a portion of your life.
No, you could write a memoir of your whole life, but
Yeah.
I guess the memoir is expected to focus on touchstone events and turning points from the author's life.
Yes, I thought of
Rather than-
autobiography as something where you can see the end, you know what the end will be from the beginning. And I think of memoir, or some anyway, you write it to find out what happens. You know, it's sort of more subterranean, and it's exploratory in that sense. Well, what did happen, or in terms of your own life, what is this life that you've lived or are living? You know, those questions, actually, they're the same that any writer, I think, engages.
I think you're also allowed to talk more about your emotions in a memoir. That's what I meant from a life. Kathleen, you've published 2 novels and a number of short stories. Was the writing process for this book much different?
Well, that's the interesting thing, because I have used first-person singular quite a lot. And Still Waters in Niger, which was my first called novel, and
Called novel.
it was called
Are you
called
revealing
a novel.
something here?
Although people said, is this an autobiographical novel, or what do we call this? And I found, and my second, who occupies this house similarly, and it's very strange, because somebody said to me only recently about, she read to us in the late afternoon, they said, I have to keep reminding myself that this is called a memoir because it reads like a novel. So I think actually writers and readers have very different, expectations of these, and the spectrum is very large for fiction or memoir. And so it's hard to say. I can only say in my experience, it's not that different.
In your case, Stephen, haven't all of your works, which includes 12 books, been nonfiction? mostly writing about other people's
Well,
lives.
I wrote a fake novel. I wrote a Romano Clay, which was about Studio 54. And then I was able to just almost do whatever I wanted to, make up situations and stories and all the rest around that setting of Studio 54, which we didn't call it that. We called it the Club. But the other books were all heavily researched nonfiction books, mostly biographies. They call them unauthorized. I don't know what's an authorized biography, but all the other books mostly were nonfiction books.
In many cases about pop culture, the Beach Boys, the Beatles.
The Beatles, the Beach Boys, Calvin Klein, Halston, on and on.
But your book does not at all sound like a work of journalism.
Thank you.
Well, so you must have been very conscious of tone.
Well, I was conscious of tone only because when you write about yourself, especially something like this book, which is so very, very personal, it's very, very hard to find the right tone and to find the right voice. And as I like to tell people, it took me 50 years to write this book. And it actually did, in a way, because I went back and I found things that I wrote in college that I thought were part of the book, and they're either too self-pitying or go too much in depth. So you really have to develop a voice, and I think that's why it reads more like a novel.
But and I throw this out to both of you, did you still feel like you had to research your lives, or at least the times you were writing about?
In terms of what I was writing about, when I was writing about Nigeria or France, I wanted to be absolutely sure that I wasn't writing something about the place, either its history or the sort of facts of the place. I didn't want to mistake any of those, so I did quite a lot of research around that.
Well, you have to remember, you try to remember as accurately as possible, and
Exactly.
I know if you were to ask me, what were you doing at a certain time in your life, I'm not sure I remembered all that clearly.
No.
I'd need prompts.
Exactly, and I found in the Diana Trilling piece I had lots of journals, so I read the journals in order to know what we had said to each other. But the feeling of it is what you put in, don't you think, Stephen? That is the...
Well, I think that's very important. I think also, though, I mean, I wanted it to be true. It is true. I mean, in fact, and I was so concerned about other people who had written memoirs, and they lied about certain issues or certain things, and then they were terribly embarrassed about it. So I certainly didn't want that to happen.
I don't want you to get into politics right
No, I'm not
Steve.
I wasn't talking about that. I was actually talking about... well, never mind that. I'm not going to talk about politics. So what happens is I find that I conflated, and this is a normal, natural thing to do. What we think are specific memories actually are a conflation of memories that may not have happened at the same time, but may be similar, and we put them together that way. And so that was very important to me, and I did do... one of the most difficult things about writing a memoir, especially a memoir like this about a 15-year-old kid trying to kill himself and winds up in a psychiatric hospital and goes through conversion therapy, especially something like this, I wanted to get it accurate. I wanted to get things accurate. And in fact, I have made a mistake in the book. This is the first time I'm admitting to it. And it was that...
Corrected for the second edition.
When the police... when the policeman is, they're taking me to the hospital, he says to me, "Do you like the Dodgers, the Brooklyn Dodgers?" And because it was very, very much in my mind, the Brooklyn Dodgers. But when I went back and I said they had already moved to Los Angeles the year before, I had the policeman saying that to me. So I mean, I conflated all of it in my head, but that's the only factual mistake.
But as you've just revealed, there's a lot of dramatic stuff in this book, and yet it's often very funny. Was that important to you to have that, have a sense of humor about some rather traumatic events that you were relating?
Well, I think that's what I meant when I said I had to find the right tone, because it was overly dramatic, other drafts of it, self-pitying, a whole bunch of stuff like that. And in real life, I'm actually funny. So I decided I should just tell this story, and make the jokes that I felt were appropriate.
In your case, Kathleen, you talked about the Diana Trilling piece.
Mm-hmm.
Did you think of the various chapters as separate essays in a sense?
Yes, I wrote each of them separately as discrete pieces, and they were published that way. And then when I had them, the last one I wrote was the one that's set in Nigeria. The others had been, the others I had begun because when I remembered a certain moment in my life, like the 12-year-old in the music class with the boy, Norman de Carteret, I thought of him often because going down the New Jersey Turnpike there was the Carteret, the exit, so I'd always think, oh, Norman. And
not named after him, by the way.
Not named after him. But I think of that, that Robert Pinsky line, the ground where the centaur walks. It's like something has happened. And this is where it is. So I was recalled to Norman de Carteret, the boy I'd known only for a brief time when we were 12, and this music class. But I couldn't think of that moment and that tragic boy and that amazing teacher without thinking about the feeling of this book I had discovered by chance, Lucy Gayheart, that was written by Willa Cather. And I'd never read a Willa Cather novel before, but I happened to be reading it then.
If you ask people about Willa Cather, they're going to say My Antonia.
Right.
They're not going to say Lucy Gayheart.
Right.
But Lucy Gayheart was I think her 11th novel. So
it was a very late novel, and I only read it because I had been advised to read Jane Eyre because I liked books about girls who were orphans and badly treated and all. So I was told
Why do you
to
think
go
you did?
to Jane Eyre to read Jane Eyre, but I found myself instead of in front of the B's in the library, I found myself in front of the C's, and there was a book with a girl's name on the spine. So that was the reason I read it. I took it off and I started reading it, and as I read it, there was Norman across the table reading a book about really pictures of boats and ships and all. And it was that I think played out through the story. And I could never remember. That was the thing that interested me. In memory, how often memory of a certain time in my life was inseparable from the feeling of a book I was reading at the time. I imagine everybody has these memories, whether they're books or movies or whatever.
Some kind of trigger, and we'll get into that in a moment. My guests are Kathleen Hill, whose memoir she read to us in the late afternoons, A Life in Novels, and Stephen Gaines, whose book is One of These Things First, a memoir. This is Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI New York 99.5 FM. When you decide to write about yourself, how important is it to consider whether readers will actually be interested in the story that you want to tell?
Well, for myself, I think I wrote it because I couldn't understand why Lucy Gayheart was all wrapped up in that memory. And I wrote it for that reason, to find out what was the connection between these. And I figured if it was imperative enough for me, then maybe somebody else would find it. Again, it's like this place where something is calling to you or speaking to you from a place. And you feel if you respond, it's more than just your own personal response. There's something larger in the question. You don't know what it is, sort of you're at sea, but it's to travel that distance, or to remember it enough, or I don't know what it is really, but I don't know. It's the question, some question. It's like, what I think of it as is like, sort of an arm rising out of the sea, waiting for you to catch hold of it. And maybe you don't. Most times you don't, but sometimes you do. I don't know if it interests other people or not.
Well, you've told me off the air that when you were younger, you found it really hard to make small talk.
Oh,
and
I
that
did.
writing was a way
so
of
true.
dealing with all the things that were going through your head.
Yes.
So even though you're
Yes.
good at small talk now, writing
not.
still serves that purpose?
It does. I was saying that when I was certainly at that point, for so long it seemed to me all I could do was read, and I couldn't talk. I didn't know what to say. If somebody asked me something, I didn't, unless I knew them. I did have friends, but if I wanted always to be talking about something that I wasn't talking about. And I think that there are other people who write because they don't know how to talk, or felt at one point in their lives they didn't.
And writing a book allows you to digress, so you can find all of those things that connect, that you might not have even realized if you were just telling a similar story.
Exactly. You can go more deeply, and you can take something that is just sort of sketched out, and you can say, but that's only a ghostly version of something else. There's something else here, and you can follow those trains. Sometimes you get to them, and sometimes they surprise you in odd ways. Don't you think, Stephen? You're writing, and then suddenly you're in another space, and you think, well, this is where I wanted to go all the time.
A light bulb goes off, and you see something that you didn't even realize you were thinking about.
And you think, oh, this is why I wanted to write about Lucy Gayheart, not knowing, but just the sense of, for example, in Lucy Gayheart, the descriptions of the plains in Nebraska.
Which you had no. It's
I had
interesting
no connection
that
to.
Willa Cather lived in New York for much of her life, but
I
she
know.
wrote about the plains, and that's what we associate her with. And
know.
here you are growing up in Pelham, New York, and
Yeah.
and connecting somehow to a young woman in the plains.
Well, it was partly that, but it was. I remember first reading it and realizing that action didn't have to be like, I think, going on a trip or, a conversation. It could be what happened in an interior way inside somebody. And those happen to be the novels I do love, like Proust, where there's a lot of mulling around of an inner life. And Willa Cather said that in Lucy Gayheart, that it was enough just to have the sun setting over the plains, and a feeling that came from the way Lucy responded to this star, something of the kind.
How old were you when you were reading this book?
I think I was about 12. I didn't know Willa Cather, but I just found it captivating.
And I'm sure you've gone back to that book at some point. You found it was a totally different book than the one you read when you were 12 years old.
Somebody last year, a friend, got it for me on eBay, and it was the old version that I had read. Now, you just buy it in paperback. But it was actually the version that I read. And reading, I thought, this is one of the more devastating novels that I've ever come across. I thought, how did I survive this when I was 12? Because it seemed even more desperate now. But the fact was that the events in the schoolroom, in that music class, were playing out in a very similar way to what was happening in the book. And the book was preparing me for devastating news, for tragedy, for suicide. And that seemed impossible.
Suicide, a theme in both of your books. But in your case, you cover pretty much the span of your life. Stephen, you focus on actually what happens from 15 and a little after that.
A little bit.
And you only go to a more recent time at the very end in a kind of a coda.
Right, exactly. I thought I just wanted the reader to know that I turned out okay. Or I guess if the reader is reading the book, they know that I'm still here and I'm still okay. But I felt that the book needed some summation at the end, and that's why I jumped ahead. So
we were curious about what happened to them.
I know it's true, and I would actually like to write a follow-up to this that is all about what happened after this book ends. But the commercial considerations have always been enormously important to me, not just to me, but I was writing for money. That's how I got into the business. I mean, I was lucky that I got my first book, Marjo. I had never written anything before, and that was just a bit of luck. But then after that, I had an agent, and I was on a treadmill. What could we get for this? What could we do for that? The interesting thing about this book, one of these things first, is that my agent refused to represent it. He said there was no money in memoirs. Very few memoirs actually make it big. I would say, oh, Glass Castle and all that stuff. And he would say, no, this isn't going to happen that way. And so I took the book to several other agents. And they said, gee, we love this book. It's really great, but it's not going to make any money.
Which is interesting to me because the story you tell, I'm sure, is something that an awful lot of boys that age can relate to.
And I think
will very well see themselves in, which is partly what we're talking about here as the impetus for writing a memoir in the first place.
Exactly.
Right.
No, that's very true. And there's also something in it about conversion therapy. There's something in it about the longing to be different, to be somebody that everybody else expected you to be and that you're not, and coming to terms with that and deciding whether you're a good person or not, even. So there are many, many things in the book that I thought people would enjoy reading. And actually, this book got the best reviews of my entire career. Even the big selling books like the Beatles and stuff, this really got great reviews. And that was enough satisfaction, I found. I didn't care how much it sold.
In both cases, I mentioned Proust and the Madeleine. There are a number of triggers that each of you cite along the way. In your case, Kathleen, was that something that you were thinking about from the start? Did Lucy Gayheart kind of suggest to you, well, there are these other books that I read along the way that also were relevant to me at the time that I read them?
I did. After writing one, I began to think of other moments, like the time in France. And also, when Diana died, I started
Diana Trilling.
Diana Trilling died. I started to write it really to deal with sort of my own mourning of this friendship. But there was one that didn't happen that way, and it was the last written, and that was the one in Nigeria. It happened almost the flip way. What happened was I was teaching. I teach, and this course was over, and I thought, what will I read now? And I went to the bookshelf with battered books on it from years ago, and I took out Portrait of a Lady, and I realized this particular copy was bought in Lagos, Nigeria, when I was 23, and I looked at it.
Just coincidental?
Well, that's what you wonder. Everything is coincidence. Everything is accident. Or it has to be exactly the opposite. But there it was, I took it out of the shelf. It's almost falling apart. And I started thinking, well, maybe it's time to reread this book. But as I started to reread it, all these memories of Nigeria and that time in Nigeria, first arriving, and being newly married, and then reading this book, began to surface. And so that was the exact opposite. The book was the trigger for the memory.
For Proust, it was a Madeleine, a piece of food. In your case, it was books. But, Stephen, in your case, movies to some degree and movie houses?
Oh, I was deeply affected by the fact that there was a movie theater on the corner. It was a second or third run movie theater, but I could go for free
in Bensonhurst?
every day.
Or?
Yeah, it was in Borough Park, Bensonhurst, the Culver Theater. But I could, because my grandmother had a bra and girdle store on the same street as the movie theater, and she used to give free stockings to the manager for his wife who had diabetes. And these are all things that came back to me. Because of that, I was able to go to the movies for free, and they always wanted to get rid of me in the store. So they would send me, and I would spend all day by myself in the movie theater, lost in these other worlds. That was enormously important to me.
Of course, in those days, all movies were G-rated, in effect. So
that's true. I saw some shocking
things. But you probably
things.
saw some
Toys
things
in
that
the
were...
Attic, I think. I saw some really shocking movies. A couple of Tennessee Williams things slipped by that my parents didn't realize I was watching.
And did you understand what you were seeing?
I think maybe not at the moment, but I think I thought about it. And I really was educated about the world and going to the movie theater. And that's how I wound up going to film school.
Could it just as easily have been songs or a landscape or?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And by the way, I think my Madeleine was a bialy with American cheese and a cold glass.
That's a desecration, American cheese on a bialy.
I know,
Cream
but
cheese and lox.
it's in the book. It's actually in the book.
Whitefish salad.
It's actually in the book. That's what, that was what my hankering was for when there was a candy store down on the corner, and we used to go there all the time. We lived above the Bra and Girdle store, so my whole world revolved around, corpulent ladies, being stuffed into long line torture devices and everything. I saw things when I was 7 years old that no child should ever see.
Because corsets were really de rigueur in those days.
Absolutely, and they were torture devices. I mean, they had stays in them and sharp things, and you had to, really hold your breath in. And I knew more. I mean, I couldn't tell you who was on the Yankees, but I could tell you 3 different sizes of white swan bloomers. So my whole world was another place. I don't know what my Madeleine was. We'll have to think about that.
Well, you must have read Remembrance of Things Past at some point.
Yes, of course.
Did you feel some kind of a connection, or was it just reading one of the great books?
No, to me it was actually it was a big revelation reading that book. Just how he moved around and
he was also gay and he had to come to grips.
I know that didn't really strike me then. It was just how a story was being told and how it could go many, many, many different places. And I never
4 volumes.
Yes, and I never thought that I would have the talent or the opportunity to do anything like that.
My guests on Leonard Lopate at Large today are Stephen Gaines, whose memoir, One of These Things First, is published by Delphinium, and Delphinium also published Kathleen Hill's She Read to Us in the Late Afternoons, A Life in Novels. This is WBAI New York 99.5 FM.
If I could read your mind, love, what a tale your thoughts could tell. Just like a paperback novel, the kind the drugstore sells. When you reach the part where the heartaches come, the hero would be me. Heroes often fail. You won't read that book again because the ending's just too hard to take.
Before we get back to today's guests, I want to remind you that WBAI relies on you for support, and we are working to upgrade our facilities, to build a new studio and improve our on-air sound, but that takes money. So please go to givetowbai.org for details on how to become a member of this station. We prefer if you become a sustaining member. Also, a way of supporting this show. And thank you. And now we're returning to my 2 guests, both authors of memoirs. The reason that you're here together is simply that the same publisher published your memoirs. But as you're talking, are you feeling that you see certain things in what the other person did in your own process?
Well, what Stephen was just talking about, the hours in the movies, I remember Saturday afternoons. You could see the kids' movie first from 1 to 3, and then the adult movie if you stayed, so you were in there for 4 hours. Coming out and not knowing who you were or where you were going, not recognizing the world you were looking at, or if you did, it was so odd.
And you were so inside. True. I can't believe you're saying that.
Well,
the light was different also. You came out.
Exactly, and it was late
afternoon.
A different time, and maybe it was even dark. But I felt that about the novels, and that's when you were talking about that as a trigger. That's what I felt reading novels, like not being able to come out of them, or how is my life?
You read great literature. I watched junk movies.
Oh, but
and,
I did too.
And also my grandmother, I read a great deal, but I read like Sidney Sheldon and Harold Robbins, and that's what the family was reading.
right.
So, I mean, I didn't know who Willa Cather was.
Everybody at that time read Harold Robbins,
Really?
if they were Jewish and they grew up in New York, because he was telling, whether it was great literature or not, he was telling the story of your neighborhood.
That's true. I think he was actually a pretty good writer, Harold Robbins. I don't remember now, but I think he was actually a pretty good storyteller anyway.
I know when I was in high school, we had the good pages of the Harold Robbins novels. Everybody knew page 27 had to be read, if nothing else.
It's the only reason why I read Lady Chatterley's Lover when I was 14, trying to find the good pages.
Right. No, I read a lot of junk. All the time I read junk. But Willa Cather, that book, took me out of myself into the place that was happening around me in this music class. That was the difference. The junk I read didn't as much. But this was like, oh, something is happening in this music class that is terrifying. I don't know what it is. And somehow that book gave the mood of that, something that was beautiful and desperate and tragic all at the same time.
So let's talk a bit about Miss Hughes' 7th grade music class.
Oh.
But you've said that your process didn't begin with books, that came later, but rather the memory of young Mr. Norman de Carteret.
Right.
He, but it was triggered by the exit on the New Jersey Turnpike.
The New Jersey Turnpike. But things that she said, that Miss Hughes said, never left me. There were things she told us. She made of us her confidants, and when this tragedy happened, she addressed it directly, while most of us, certainly I, wanted to put as much distance as I could between this boy who actually I revered and myself. But for example,
because he was troubled, do you think? Did you connect to him for that reason?
I connected to him because I thought he knew something I didn't know. She had singled him out. She had said, you listen, the way the composer writes the music as if it's a matter of life and death. And I thought, I don't do that. What does that mean? And I was interested in him, but he was certainly not one of the it was silent moments that we exchanged. It wasn't talk. And when this happened to him, that was terrifying to everybody.
We're not going to reveal what happened.
We won't talk about what happened. Miss Hughes.
Now I have to buy the book. Seriously, don't say it. But now I'm going directly.
There are lots of reasons to read her.
Yes, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are, but it's, that's tantalizing. But go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted.
No, not at all. But what was I going? Oh, I know. It was Miss Hughes, and this I know happened. We talk about what's a matter of historical record, so to speak, and what you're not sure about. Mm-hmm. I know that she said to this group of kids, 12-year-old kids. By this time, Norman had his head buried in his arms. And she said to us, she looked at us, and then she addressed Norman, and she said, "Is there anything we can do for you, Norman?" And we were stunned that she had taken this, she had voiced something, and she had put it into, what can we do for you? And then she said, because we want you to know that you are sitting in the company of friends.
But that is making a music class more personal than most teachers would ever do.
It was extraordinary.
Now, some of the other books that you cite are quite different than Willa Cather. The Diary of a Country Priest by Georges Bernanos, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, Isaac Dinneson's Out of Africa, all because they connect to events in your life? I mean, obviously you weren't an alcoholic priest who was on the verge of dying as Bernanos' priest was. A man who felt totally out of place.
The Bernanos one was the Diary of a Country Priest. I literally stumbled over in this little storeroom we had, and I picked it up. And as I started to read, it was in French, and I'd been there enough months so I could sort of stumble.
Where were you living in France?
In the north of France, in the old, just amidst the old battlefields of World War I, and you just went no distance, and there were just cemeteries, and it was cold, and it was the people were poor, and lived within their houses because it wasn't it was cold. It wasn't Africa.
If I remember correctly, Bernanos' priest is ill and alienated from his flock, and alcoholic because he's self-medicating. Achebe's book is largely about the impact of British colonialism in Nigeria. Now, how would you come to live in France, and then, you were in Nigeria, but mostly in Niger?
Yeah, during my 20s, I spent a few years in Nigeria first, and then in France. We just didn't want to go home, We just thought, why? But we did, and then we went to Niger, which was a whole another extraordinary, and that's Still Waters in Niger is based on Niger.
Well, but then your second novel, Who Occupies This House, was about a woman who left Ireland in 1846 during the time of the potato famine. Where did that come from?
Well, it was, when we were in Niger is a place where there are cycles of famine. Famine is just a constant. And I remember looking at these children, and you couldn't look and you couldn't look away. There was nothing. It was like Norman sitting there in his bleak tragedy. There was nothing. There was no way to look or not to look. And I thought, why is this familiar to me? You're talking about your past. I thought, it's not mysterious at all. Bridget McDonough, my great-grandmother, came from Ireland to New York because of the famine in Ireland. So I had never particularly attached to that before, but having seen famine close up, I began to be interested in that past. So that was it.
I was curious about how the first word of your book is the word "and."
Oh, it is, isn't it? I read that last night. I was surprised by that, too.
It suggests that you're adding to something that we already have heard.
Do you know, I think I wrote that for another book. And then,
well, it's written in that one section is written in third person, and the rest of the book is written in first person.
You're quite right. Now that I didn't notice, but I did notice the "and." You see what you don't even know.
Your epigraph is from Peter of Sella. Is that how you pronounce it?
Right.
And it's travel by your reading all the way to paradise, and what is it? And sigh over what was lost.
Do you know, I don't understand it. It's like
But you included it in your book.
I include it. It's like so many things that I love. I don't understand it, but I feel as if it's the truth itself. So I put it in there, but I could never explain it.
Stephen, you are a co-founder of the Hampton International Film Festival.
Yes.
So the interest in films goes beyond what happened when you were a kid.
That's correct.
But I guess we shouldn't be surprised that films pop up throughout this book, which is about something totally different
Yes,
than movies.
they do. Films are constantly, he. It's so funny I talk about myself in the third person because it's hard for me to say me, but I am constantly making references to movies that I saw at that time and what it meant.
And what were some of the major triggers for you in telling this story?
Well,
I mean, other than a boy, there was another kind of trigger, a boy with a lawnmower that it has nothing to do with movies.
No, I know. It's so funny because I just read a review of the book on Goodreads, and he's called the Lawnmower Boy in the book, but the reviewer called it This Lawnmower Guy. You get the saying, This Lawnmower Guy. And I said, no, the whole point is he was this 15, 16-year-old pushing a lawnmower, and I fell in love with I only saw him for 3 seconds or 2 seconds, but he became a symbol to me. I mean, when I had sexual thoughts, it was about this lawnmower boy. And I spent, I think, a good part of my life trying to find the lawnmower boy in other people and in all different kinds of situations. Leonard, I just want to take this one moment to say that Delphinium Books published our books. God bless them. They published quality stuff, and I went to them without an agent, and it didn't make any difference to them. And I think Delphinium has done, don't you agree?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, Delphinium has just been wonderful, so I just wanted to thank them.
Thank you, Stephen, for saying that.
Like Kathleen's Norman de Carteret, you endured a fair amount of suffering in your early life, and much of it rather dramatic. You mentioned the suicide attempt in 1962 when you were 15. Then there was a stint at Payne Whitney Psychiatric Clinic where the goal was to cure you of being homosexual. Was that something that you wanted at the time?
Well, I wanted to go to Payne Whitney. I mean, it turned out it was divine.
Well, it wasn't a snake pit. It was very wealthy.
Well, I mean, I
You were a
really
poor
didn't.
kid.
I didn't really know that. Well, first of all, I had what they call touching disease, which is now called obsessive compulsive disorder, and I had to collect things and put things away, and people just thought I was nuts, and there was nobody to go to say anything. So I got labeled as a nut job. They called me, and as a homo, there was no word, So
The kids down the block gave you a really hard time.
it was two adults actually who bullied me. It was the guys that owned the candy store. I couldn't even walk by the candy store because they had big glass windows. But there was a lot of suffering. I made the suicide attempt, pretty good one too. They were going to put me into some terrible hospital, and I saw on television by accident that Marilyn Monroe had been in a place called Payne Whitney, which was the Harvard of psychiatric clinics. And because Marilyn Monroe had been there and I was a big movie fan, I wanted to go to that hospital.
And you met people in show business. For example, you met Mary Martin's husband, Richard Halliday, who was a kind of a mentor to you. He's a Broadway producer.
Absolutely a mentor. He was really, really terrific. And I just didn't meet, Richard Halliday was great, and he helped me a lot, but I met a lot of people from different walk of life that I never would have met.
And like Marilyn Monroe, you met an editor who claimed to have been a lover of John F. Kennedy.
No, the editor wasn't, but yes, there was a woman there who said that she was a lover of John F. Kennedy, and when he was elected president, he dumped her, and that's why she kind of fell into this deep depression. And we said, "Oh, she's nuts. How could she have had an affair with John F. Kennedy?" We didn't realize that hundreds of people had an affair with John F. Kennedy. But so she was there, and then there was an architect from Harvard, and there were very, very accomplished people. And so they said to me, "Listen, use your silverware this way." And Richard Halliday gave me To Kill a Mockingbird to read. So they nurtured me in a way. And then I met a brilliant young psychiatrist who said to me, "You're so unhappy being a homosexual. You don't have to be. I can make you into a heterosexual. Do you want that?" I wanted that more than anything in the world. So the conversion therapy, 10 years I went through conversion therapy, was something I wanted, not forced on me.
And now most people consider it a debunked science.
Well, it failed, for one thing. It failed, didn't work with me.
I'm speaking to Stephen Gaines, whose memoir is titled One of These Things First, and to Kathleen Hill, whose memoir is She Read to Us in the Late Afternoons, A Life in Novels. In a little while, I'll ask you how you came up with those titles. But let's, this is Leonard Lopate at Large on WBAI, New York 99.5 FM. Some of the things that you write about happening at Payne Whitney are quite disturbing. Here we are at this place that Time magazine called the Harvard of Psychiatric Clinics, and you describe patients being forcibly sedated and mistreated by the staff as well as by one another. And then they're put into padded cells in a place where people paid a lot of money.
Well, they were very disturbed people. There was a floor system, and on the 7th floor, the people were very, very disturbed. They might have had means and been wealthy and been in this private place. They were very, very sick, and they were given chlorpromazine. Look, that's what they knew to do. Shock treatment. If you were depressed, everybody got shock
So none
treatment.
of these things are probably done today, we hope.
I really don't know, but I don't think they did them to be mean. My first night there, they put me into a padded cell because I wanted to go home, and I started kicking things and banging things, and that's what they did to you if you got out of. So I spent my first night in Manhattan ever. I spent in a padded cell. I'll probably go out that way too. But anyway, I have very good memories of Payne Whitney. It was not a snake pit, and they tried really, really hard to make me happy.
But they could have also just accepted the fact that you were homosexual. It was just too early for that?
Not in 1962. Yes, in 1962, it was still considered a disease by the American Psychiatric Association, on and on. It was considered a disease. And Freud said that in rare cases, we can find the thwarted heterosexual in people and bring them back and make them heterosexual. So I said, please do that to me.
And you did attempt it for quite a few years.
For 10 years, yes. Most of the cure was having sex with women. That was, it's a whole other story. Yeah. And that's the second part, but that's what the cure was.
And I would love to hear what
some
of those women.
What
some of those women.
I think they liked it. I think I was kind of, I learned it. I learned what to do. I always used to say, petit déjeuner, déjeuner. I knew the way to do the thing, and I think everybody liked it. I didn't mind it.
So when did you decide to stop faking it?
Well, I really
did you feel you were faking it?
I wouldn't say faking it because there were lovely, lovely people women that I had a very long affair with a woman who had Hodgkin's disease and who was so I didn't think I was faking it, but I was always looking for the lawnmower boy, always looking for that lawnmower boy, and I was hurting the women. It wasn't fair to them.
That's what I meant
I
earlier.
was a cad. It was a science experiment. I felt bad that what I was doing, so I stopped.
It almost sounds like something that you see in the movie where somebody is engaged in some activity and then suddenly we get a little shot of this kid with a lawnmower to remind us about the reality of the mindset.
And also, they taught me to hate who I was. They taught me that I was sick. And for 10 years, they drilled that into me. This is an illness, you're sick, and you can be cured. So I didn't have a very good impression of myself for all those years.
A major figure in the story is Wayne Myers, the young Freudian psychiatrist who promised to cure you of your homosexuality. And you hoped that he would succeed at the time.
Right.
You went to see him 40 years later.
Right. Everybody thinks I should be angry at Wayne Myers, but he was trying to help me. And I did he apologized. That's the beginning in the book. He apologized. He said he was sorry, and we were both near tears. And I said he didn't have to be. He taught me so many other things aside from the sexual aspect, how to have a well-ordered life, how to give everything a good try. And he was a wonderful man. And then, I
was at Mrs. Hughes of your story to some extent.
Yes, and then exactly, and then I read in Bruce Springsteen's autobiography, he went to Wayne Myers and thanked him tremendously. So then I thought, at first I felt, like, gee, he took away Wayne Myers from me, Bruce Springsteen. I thought, he was my own Wayne Myers.
And why did Bruce Springsteen go to Wayne
I don't know, but I guess we laid on the same sofa. We were in the same psychiatric couch. Now it galvanizes me, Bruce Springsteen and me, but he did a better job with Bruce.
You feel he didn't do a good job with you?
I think he did his best, but he should have at some point said, Stephen, you're never going to be heterosexual. Enjoy yourself.
And why did you feel compelled to go back and even visit him? Do you want to settle, I don't mean settle scores, but to just say, hey, look, I've done okay?
No, not at all. I was depressed. I was going through a depression. I mean, I had a host of other issues. And a lot of the doctors, my regular doctor, my general practitioner, and everything kept saying to me, you should go and see Wayne Myers. I said, why? They said, just go and see him. I think they all knew. So I made the appointment to go and see him. And it was that one appointment where he apologized, and with near tears in his eyes, and I walked across the room and I shook his hand. He still sent me a bill.
But by that time, I forgot what it's called, the psychiatric rule book had now declared homosexuality to be just a normal part of human
in 73
sexuality.
Or 74, they changed it. Yes, exactly. But there's still conversion therapy. It's part of, I know we're not getting into politics, but it was part of the Republican platform that parents should be allowed for religious reasons to try and convert their homosexual
In fact,
children.
it's only been outlawed in a few states very recently. California, I think, only in the last couple of years.
It's just remarkable that they don't understand this can't be changed. And instead of destroying a person's self-esteem and all the rest and making them miserable for the rest of their lives, say, okay, that's fine.
We have just a few minutes left for this conversation, which makes me a bit sad. But I want to get to the titles of the books. Now, Kathleen, your book is She Read to Us in the Late Afternoons.
Yes.
You are referring to?
You know, buried in the Diana section, there's something about the voice.
You read books for Diana Trilling, including all of Remembrance of Things Past?
I did. I read that to her. It took us 6 years, but then we read other things afterwards. And as it is told in this story, in the book that we're talking about, one day I was coming back from reading to her, and I watched the sunset setting over Riverside Park, because we didn't live far from each other. And that night I had a dream, and it had to do with you've missed the most important thing of all in your life. And I didn't know what that was, but it was called the Pearl of Great Price in the dream. And there was an inset in which my mother was reading to my brother and me A Christmas Carol when I was very, very little. And there was a red streak of sun out the window. And I was trying to find how I could bring that into it. And actually my agent wonderfully read a story I'd written, which was called that. She read to us in the late afternoon. She said, look at this right here. This will go. And she was absolutely right. The wonderful Anna Stein, I want to give her credit, and it did. And so she read to us in the late afternoons has to do with those very early memories of the voice and Diana, and also coming to, well, I better not go on, I think now.
Well, we only have a couple of minutes left, but in your case, Stephen, you can't credit your agent with anything because you told me he didn't want to handle this book. But where did the title "One of These Things" first
Nick
come
Drake
from?
is a cult figure. He is an English singer-songwriter, killed himself in the 1970s. He wrote a song called "One of These Things" first about all the different possibilities, the variations, who we could be, inanimate objects, real people, lovers. And we never were able to get the rights, so we could never quote the entire. So everybody says, why is the book called "One of These Things" first? Well, we didn't get the rights.
Well, I love the title of your bestseller, Philistines at the Hedgerow.
Thank you. Thank you. They told me not to name it that either. They hated Philistines at the Hedgerow. Honestly, I had to get a letter from an advertising executive, like a letter from a teacher or something, saying, let them call it Philistines at the Hedgerow. They didn't think anybody would know what a Philistine was. I said, only a Philistine would know what a Philistine was.
Since I'm a city boy, I had problems with the hedgerow part.
Well, fortunately, that book is still selling, Philistines at the Hedgerow. I'm very proud.
The two books we've been discussing are One of These Things First, a memoir by Stephen Gaines, and She Read to Us in the Late Afternoons, a life and novels by Kathleen Hill, both published by Delphinium. What a great pleasure it has been talking with you today.
And you.
Yes,
Leonard.
me too.
And you,
It's
Stephen.
so much fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both.
And that brings us to the end of our show. My great thanks to today's guests, Kathleen Hill and Stephen Gaines, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, and to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who is at the audio controls. Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.